Saga of Portugal, from borderland kingdom to maritime vanguard. Part 1. Born on the Edge, the formation of a kingdom. In the restless heart of medieval Europe, where shifting loyalties and swords forged borders, an unassuming strip of land on the far Atlantic edge began the unlikely journey that would make it a global name. The story of the Portuguese Empire, that remarkable web of trading posts, colonies, and outposts that stretched across oceans and centuries, did not begin with grand ships or dreams of empires. It began instead with war, with faith, and with a stubborn will to be free. Long before Portugal laid claim to distant continents, it first carved itself from the rocky soil and turbulent politics of the Iberian Peninsula. In the 12th century, the region that would become Portugal was little more than a marcher fief, a volatile borderland pressed between the swelling might of the Christian kingdoms of the north and the powerful Muslim taifas of Al-Andalus to the south. Networks of feudal allegiance and dynastic ambition crisscrossed these lands, which were as often ravaged by war and famine as they were by peace. At the center of this crucible stood Afonso Henriques, the founder whose ambition would shape a nation. Initially a count under the overlordship of the Kingdom of Leon, Afonso's opportunity and challenge came with the death of his father and the inheritance of a contested legacy. Pitted even against his own mother, Queen Teresa, Afonso seized the moment at the Battle of São Mamadé in 1128, defeating her loyalists in a conflict that mixed family intrigue with the wider tides of Iberian politics. But it was in 1139, at the Battle of Urique, that Afonso Henriques would transform himself from a regional warlord to an aspiring king. Tradition holds that, facing a superior Muslim host, Afonso and his men claimed divine favor, and their decisive victory became a rallying point for an independent identity. Afonso's subsequent declaration as King of Portugal may have been ambitious, perhaps even premature, but it set into motion decades of ceaseless campaigning. The young king pushed south against Moorish strongholds and north against rival Christian princes, winning territory and forging the outlines of a distinct realm. It would take decades for royal propaganda and realpolitik to convince the courts of Europe that Portugal was more than a rebellious fief. Through patient negotiation, battlefield resilience, and the vital pursuit of papal support, Afonso and his successors bent history to their will. In 1179, Pope Alexander III issued the bull Manifestus Probatum, declaring Portugal a sovereign Christian kingdom, the first European power to win such status so soon after its emergence. Almost as enduring as the papal charter was the precise definition of Portugal's borders. After the final conquest of the Algarve from Muslim rule in 1249 and a crucial treaty with Castile, the kingdom's edges became some of the most stable in Europe, essentially matching modern Portugal. Geography would prove destiny. To the east and north lay Spain, sometimes friend, often rival. But to the west stretched the forbidding, bountiful Atlantic. Unlike other aspiring kingdoms of the era, Portugal's landward ambitions were hemmed in. The sea, once a source of danger and isolation, would in time become a path of opportunity. The seeds of a maritime future. For much of the early Middle Ages, Portugal remained a land-bound society, shaped by feudal relationships and animated by the long struggle of the Reconquista. Rural estates and church lands dominated the social order. Peasantry and minor nobility toiled under the weight of obligations to king and god alike. Yet even as the kingdom consolidated its territory, subtle currents of change began to swirl. By the reign of Dinis the Fun in the late 13th and early 14th centuries, Portugal was already preparing for a wider role. Dinis, known to history as the Farmer King, moved to develop agriculture, establish universities, and most crucially, to found the Portuguese Navy. Though his primary concern was protecting the coast from pirates and rivals, the creation of a naval infrastructure would lay the early foundation for later centuries of exploration. Cities like Lisbon, Porto, and Coimbra gained new importance as centers of trade, law, and royal administration. Merchants and artisans, once marginal figures, grew in status as Portugal tapped into regional trade networks and exchanged wool, salt, oil, and wine for imported goods. Throughout the 14th century, events outside Portugal shaped its destiny. The Italian merchant republics dominated Mediterranean commerce, but Muslim powers held the keys to the overland spice routes, and Northern Europe was experiencing its own commercial awakening. Portugal's remote coastal position, once a disadvantage, became strategically valuable as traditional pathways of wealth grew more contested. Catholicism, woven deep into the Portuguese soul, added further impetus for a unique path. The legacy of the Reconquista instilled in both rulers and their subjects a sense of crusading fervor that would later meld perfectly with ambitions for overseas conquest. Religion and commerce shared a language, the language of divine mission. But not all was progress. The 14th century also delivered crisis. A devastating outbreak of the Black Death decimated Portugal's population. Labor shortages upended the old feudal order, and with the death of King Fernando in 1383, the kingdom faced succession chaos. Castile's crown eyed Portugal hungrily, hoping to absorb its territories. It was in the crucible of this emergency that Portugal's identity truly solidified. João of Avis, leading a coalition of nobles, townsmen, and knights, rallied opposition and scored a decisive victory against Castilian invaders at Aljubarrota in 1385. The independence of Portugal was not only secured but celebrated, defined as much by what it held back as what it conquered. In the aftermath, the Treaty of Windsor cemented an alliance with England, one of the oldest in the world, a relationship whose effects would ripple forward into the Age of Empire. João I's dynasty. The House of Avis would preside over a Portugal that, wounded but undaunted, began to look beyond its shores. By the closing years of the 14th century, the kingdom was stable, its borders were secure, and a generation of rulers and thinkers shaped by war, faith, and opportunity stood poised at the edge of the known world, ready to transform a marginal polity into a maritime power. The illustrious generation and the shape of things to come. In the early decades of the 15th century, the House of Avis nurtured an extraordinary family. João I and his English wife, Philippa of Lancaster, raised children whose talents and ambitions would reverberate far beyond Iberia. This illustrious generation, as Portuguese historians would later call them, included warriors, scholars, diplomats, and most famously, Prince Henry the Navigator. Henry, neither king nor general, but a son fascinated by the sea, emerges as the personification of Portugal's shifting destiny. Henry envisioned a Portugal that could break free of its limitations by mastering navigation, seeking wealth and conversion beyond Africa's unknown shores. In 1415, the first step was taken not by Henry alone, but with his royal brothers and the approval of the crown. Portuguese forces, drawn by twin motives of faith and profit, crossed the Straits of Gibraltar and seized Ceuta, a fortified city on the Moroccan coast. It was a victory charged with symbolic significance. The old crusading impulse redirected across the water, the first marker of an overseas empire. But Ceuta itself would ultimately be less important than the mindset and machinery it awakened. The city was more a liability than an asset, an isolated outpost costly to defend and yielding little of the gold or spice that the initiators had hoped for. Yet it emboldened a generation, most crucially Prince Henry, to imagine newer, farther horizons. Henry established a base of exploration at Sagres, on Portugal's windswept southern tip. The so-called School of Sagres, while not a formal institution, was a magnet for mariners, cartographers, shipwrights, and astronomers. Here, practical knowledge and bold theory mingled, and Portugal's navigators refined the lateen-sailed caravella ship designed for the unknown. Guided by Henry's patronage, Portuguese captains inched ever farther down the West African coast. Their progress was methodical, sometimes halting, always dangerous. The Cape Boyador, long feared as the edge of the world, was finally rounded in 1434 by Gil Inez, shattering old legends and unleashing a wave of possibility. Each new stretch of coastline charted was not just a technical triumph, but a profound psychological victory. Year by year, the unknown receded. Integral to this expansion was not only technology, but ambition, both sacred and profane. Portugal sought the mythical wealth of Africa, the gold rumored to flow from the fabled kingdom of Prester John, and, not least, new souls to convert to Christianity. But the quest for profit was never far. The earliest Portuguese activities in Africa were entwined with the beginnings of a slave trade that would, in later centuries, leave a stain on global history. As Henry's expeditions advanced south, they discovered and began to settle the Atlantic archipelagos Madeira and the Azores, transforming them into agricultural and strategic way statons. Plantation economies, reliant on enslaved labor, provided a model that would later be expanded dramatically in far vaster territories. By the time of Prince Henry's death in 1460, Portugal was no longer a provincial backwater, but the vanguard of European exploration. Its ships reached farther than any others. Its rulers and merchants were poised to turn exploration into empire, to seek not just gold, but routes to the wealth of India and the East. The foundations, political, technical, psychological, of a global empire had been laid. The next generation would be the true inheritors of Henry's legacy, leading Portugal beyond Africa and toward a world-spanning destiny. In the coming decades, new names, Bartolomeu Dias, Vasco da Gama, would turn vision into reality. The Atlantic was no longer a border. It had become Portugal's open door. The age of discovery was at hand. The Saga of Portugal, from borderland kingdom to maritime vanguard. Part 2, Boundaries Broken, the Age of Discovery Unleashed. As the 15th century entered its final decades, the transformation of Portugal from a marginalized European kingdom into a nation of explorers and traders was well underway. The compulsion to reach ever farther was rooted in both urgency and opportunity. Ottoman victories in the eastern Mediterranean had choked the overland routes for spices, silks, and gems from Asia. In the courts of Lisbon, a staggering possibility took hold. If the riches of India and beyond could not be reached by land, perhaps they could be won by daring the sea's full circumference. The passing of Prince Henry the Navigator did not mark the end of Portugal's ambition. On the contrary, his death in 1460 seemed almost to intensify the maritime calling. The Portuguese crown, having amassed crucial information, gradually made the pursuit of a sea route to India not just the dream of a select few, but but the national project of a state. The enterprise of Dias, Africa's end. Unveiled Portugal's navigators, seasoned by decades of Atlantic and African voyages, reached ever further down the African coastline. With each passing year, they encountered new lands, peoples, and commodities: gold, ivory, pepper, and with increasing frequency, captives sold into slavery. The slave trade, as yet on a small scale, grew in step with exploration, intertwining the fates of Europe, Africa, and eventually the Americas in a commerce both lucrative and tragic. In 1481, King João II, known as the Perfect Prince, ascended to the throne. An administrator of exceptional will and intellect, João gathered the experience of previous decades and focused imperial energies on completing the path to Asia. He established improved navigational methods, mapped the African coast in ever greater detail, and pushed his explorers toward the continent's great enigma. How far did Africa extend, and would its southern tip ever yield a sea passage to the Indian Ocean? The monumental answer would come in 1488. Bartholomew Dias, a Portuguese nobleman and skilled navigator, was tasked with leading a fleet farther than any before it. Dias sailed along the well-trod trade paths of West Africa before catching favorable winds, known only by experience and rumor, and pushing south. His ships, driven by the gales and currents around Africa's southernmost headlands, found themselves on unfamiliar eastern coasts. For the first time in European memory, a ship had sailed around the end of Africa. The Atlantic and Indian Oceans were now revealed as one continuous expanse. Dias's men called the fearsome promontory the Cape of Storms, a testament to the peril faced. But King João, hearing of the deed, baptized it the Cape of Good Hope. The dreams of Portugal of dominion in the east, of spice and silk and glory, were tantalizingly close. The leap to India, Da Gama's passage. It remained for one more expedition to finish what Dias had begun, to reach the fabled markets of India, where pepper and cinnamon were as precious as gold in Europe, and the hope of royal profit burned brightest. King Manuel I entrusted the effort to Vasco da Gama. Da Gama, scion of a noble family and veteran of maritime service, assumed command of a hardy fleet in 1497. Da Gama's voyage, more precarious than any before it, confirmed the limits of Portuguese resolve and ingenuity. Bearing fewer than 200 men and mortal risk, the fleet rounded the Cape of Good Hope, braved the unpredictable currents of the Indian Ocean, and called at the unfamiliar ports of East Africa. Here, in places like Mozambique and Mombasa, the Portuguese encountered trading cities animated by Swahili, Arab, Persian, and Indian cultures, cosmopolitan nodes of commerce that dwarfed Portugal's own cities in their scale and ethnic variety. In Malinde, da Gama secured the guidance of a seasoned navigator, possibly Indian or Arab, able to draw upon generations of knowledge regarding the seasonal monsoon winds. With these winds at their back, the Portuguese fleet crossed the Indian Ocean, reaching the Malabar coast and the splendid city-state of Calicut. Here, amid the cacophony of markets rich with pepper, cardamom, pearls, and textiles, da Gama achieved the impossible: a direct maritime link from Western Europe to India. The initial encounter was less than harmonious misunderstandings, contempt for the Portuguese gifts, and rising suspicion among local authorities foreshadowed centuries of fraught engagement. But the fact of the crossing, the fact that these Atlantic mariners had outflanked the entire Islamic and Venetian trading network, electrified Europe. Da Gama's voyage occupied 2 grueling years and cost many lives. not only to violence, but to the scurvy and deprivation inherent in such unprecedented travel. Yet its impact was seismic. Upon their return, Da Gama and his crew were feted as heroes, and the crown of Portugal laid claim not only to the route, but to the trade and territory that might be prized away by force or cunning. Embers of empire, commerce, conflict, and the shaping of the Estado da India. The imperializing ambitions of Portugal blossomed most fiercely under King Manuel I. Rapidly, the quest to dominate the Indian Ocean transformed from dream to policy. A new class of merchants, royal officials, and mariners, many schooled in the spirit of crusade, most driven by visions of profit, were unleashed. The Portuguese soon learned that the riches of India and Asia could not be seized merely by trading. The Indian Ocean world was no blank slate. It was a vibrant economic ecosystem, humming with established networks stretching from the Swahili coast through the sultanates of Arabia and India to the sophisticated civilizations of Southeast Asia and China. Asian and Middle Eastern merchants, Muslim and Hindu shipmasters, and Chinese tribute envoys all moved through these networks, largely independent of European interests. When the second major Portuguese fleet arrived under Pedro Álvares Cabral, it did so with clear instructions: establish trade by negotiation, but enforce Portugal's presence with arms if needed. On his outward-bound voyage, Cabral's fleet, blown far west by Atlantic winds, landed by serendipity on the Brazilian coast, an omen of further empire. But his real objective was Calicut, and the effort quickly turned violent. After a breakdown in relations and the killing of several Portuguese, Cabral retaliated by bombarding the city, a glimpse of the trade by cannon that would define much of European expansion in Asia. Recognizing the necessity of a fortified presence, King Manuel sent a succession of fleets, each more heavily armed and administratively organized than the last. Soon, the Portuguese conquered and built strong points in Cochin, where local rulers welcomed them as allies against rival trading cities, and began to impose their will along the Indian littoral. The decisive figure of this era was Afonso de Albuquerque, famed for his audacity, cruelty, and strategic brilliance. As Viceroy of the Estado da India, Albuquerque's formula was simple but radical. Rather than seeking only influence, Portugal would physically dominate the choke points of Asian trade. In rapid succession, they captured Goa on the west coast of India, making it the capital of their Asian dominions, Malacca on the Malay Peninsula, gateway to the Spice Islands and China Seas, and Hormuz at the mouth of the Persian Gulf, control point between East and West. The Portuguese monopoly on the spice trade, tenuous but lucrative, depended on a network of forts and fleets, on alliances and bribery, and on the thunder of cannons. There was little attempt to create settler colonies, nor was there significant penetration into the inland empires of India or China. Instead, Portugal built its own trading regime atop the older systems, inserting itself as collector of taxes, enforcer of permits, and regulator of shipping through the Cartaz, a sea license now essential for all merchant vessels in Portuguese waters. Resistance was constant, from dispossessed Muslim merchants, from rising local powers like the Ottoman Empire and the sultanates of the Indian Ocean, and sometimes from enraged local populations. The Portuguese, few in number, but sinewed by discipline and superior naval firepower, met force with force. Yet, even as Portugal tightened its grip on the spice routes, it began to experience the fragility of its scattered possessions. Corruption, tropical diseases, the high death toll among soldiers and sailors, and the difficulties of supplying and defending a global web of outposts weakened even the apparent triumphs. And still the explorers pressed farther. Portuguese ships, sometimes in the teeth of monsoon storms, reached the coasts of Ceylon, Sri Lanka, the legendary Spice Islands of the Maluku archipelago, and the far edge of Japan. The web of commerce and contact now spanned the globe's widest bounds. Eastward ambitions, Macau, Japan, and the edge of empire. The Portuguese claim to be the first truly global empire rests not only on their reach toward India, Africa, and Brazil, but on their persistent forays deeper into Asia. Now based at Malacca, Portuguese navigators sailed ever eastward, propelled by news of fabulous wealth. The Maluku Islands' nutmeg, mace, and cloves were more valued than ever, drawing Portuguese rivals, first the Spanish, eventually the Dutch and English. Armed trading posts, Vitorias, were established wherever the political circumstances permitted, and sometimes where they did not. Contact with China was attempted, fitfully at first and sometimes disastrously, as the Ming authorities regarded the Portuguese as unruly pirates. But after much negotiation, and by leveraging their role as intermediaries in the trade between China and Japan, the Portuguese were in 1557 granted a foothold at Macau. This outpost, won by treaty and tribute rather than conquest, would remain in European hands for over 4 centuries, serving as Europe's principal portal to the vast markets and learning of East Asia. Japan, still in the throes of civil war but hungry for new knowledge and goods, also welcomed the Portuguese. In 1543, the first European firearms arrived in the archipelago, transforming local conflict. Japanese silver, exchanged for Chinese silks through Portuguese ships, fueled a highly profitable triangular trade. Yet, Portugal's reach outpaced its grasp. Missionaries, eager for souls, clashed with local rulers' anxieties. Gunpowder and print met suspicion as often as wonder. The fragility of these relationships became apparent by the end of the century, when exclusion policies in Japan and the growing power of Dutch and English fleets began to erode Portuguese influence in the East. The Saga of Portugal, from borderland kingdom to maritime vanguard. Part 3. Atlantic Worlds, Brazil, Slavery, and the Making of a Colonial System. Even as Portuguese ships were pushing deep into the Indian Ocean and constructing far-flung trade outposts, the empire's fate was also being decided far to the west. The Atlantic, once a mere boundary, became a new axis of expansion, commerce, and cultural transformation. Here, the vast forests and river valleys of South America beckoned, while old ties to Africa deepened and darkened in ways both lucrative and horrific. By the 16th century, Portugal's global vision was as much Atlantic as Asian. The accidental discovery, Brazil's entry into the empire. Though Portuguese attention and capital were primarily focused on the spice trade with Asia, the chance arrival on the coast of Brazil would transform the balance of the imperial enterprise. The story began in 1500 as Pedro Álvares Cabral led a fleet intended for India, only to be caught by Atlantic winds that carried him far west to the coast of what would become Brazil. Planting a cross and performing rites of possession, Cabral claimed this land for the Portuguese crown, making use of the recently negotiated Treaty of Tordesillas, a papal arbitrate treaty with Spain that divided the non-European world, largely to Portugal's benefit in South America. At first, Brazil seemed only modestly promising, a land rich in timber, especially Brazil wood, from which the country would draw its name, but not displaying the concentrated urban wealth or market sophistication of Asia. Early contact was marked by tentative exchanges with indigenous peoples who traded wood and small game for iron tools, beads, and fabric. Over time, a network of Vitoria's trading posts sprang up along the coast, but systematic colonization lagged behind. That would change as the crown realized three things: the persistent threat of French and other European interlopers, the immense agricultural potential of the land, and the economic possibilities in plantation crops, especially sugarcane. In the 1530s, King João III initiated the captaincy system, carving the coast into hereditary land grants offered to noblemen and entrepreneurs who undertook to settle and defend their domains. These early attempts at colonization were mixed in outcome. Portuguese authorities struggled against the environmental hardships, indigenous resistance, and the profound distances involved. Some captaincies failed outright, devastated by mismanagement and attack. Others, like Pernambuco and São Vicente, achieved a tenuous prosperity. Sugar and slavery, Brazil's plantation revolution. The decisive transformation of Brazil from a marginal holding to the beating heart of Portuguese imperial fortunes came with sugar. Drawing on experience from Madeira and the Azores, Portuguese planters began the large-scale cultivation of sugarcane, reliant first on indigenous labor, and after epidemics and resistance decimated local populations, on enslaved Africans. The plantation complex that took root in Brazil was a fusion of European capital, African labor, and American land. A constellation that would become the model and the curse of much of the colonial Atlantic. Mill towns, known as engenhos, became foci of economic life, with planters amassing political and social power that often rivaled or even eclipsed that of royal officials. Demand for sugar in Europe soared with the growth of urban markets and consumption habits, ensuring huge profits for successful planters and the merchants who handled shipment and trade. But with wealth came the insatiable hunger for labor, one that could not be satisfied by dwindling indigenous populations. Here, the Atlantic slave trade scaled up with terrifying speed. Africa in chains, the intensification of the slave trade. Portugal's early presence on the coasts of West and Central Africa had begun with the pursuit of gold, ivory, and pepper. But as the needs of Atlantic plantations grew, these forts and Vitorias in places like Elmina, in modern Ghana, Luanda, in Angola, and dozens of smaller enclaves became nodes in a new commerce, the forced transportation of millions of Africans to the Americas. Portuguese traders did not conquer the African interior. Instead, they worked within, alongside, and sometimes against powerful African kingdoms and polities. Merchandise such as firearms, alcohol, textiles, and metal goods were exchanged for enslaved people, captured through war, raiding, or tribute by African middlemen. In exchange for European goods, African leaders would supply captives prisoners of war, condemned criminals, or even those kidnapped by rival groups, to be funneled through the slave castles and loaded onto ships bound across the Atlantic. The human cost was incalculable. Families and communities were shattered, entire regions destabilized, and a new world of violence, displacement, and social disintegration emerged in many parts of coastal Africa. The slaving system, while profitable for certain African elites, soon became a catastrophe for the continent's societies as a whole. For Portugal, the Atlantic slave trade was both the lubricant of plantation expansion and a source of immense wealth. Lisbon and increasingly Salvador and Rio de Janeiro became among the great slave ports of early modern history. It is estimated that of all Africans forced into slavery in the Americas during the transatlantic era, nearly half endured the passage in Portuguese ships, mostly to Brazil. Yet, African influences endured and even transformed the cultures of Brazil and Portugal. Religious practices, music, language, foodways, and kinship structures were preserved, transformed, and blended into Creole cultures that would offer resistance and beauty amid suffering. Brazil's colonial society, complexity and contradiction. By the 17th century, Brazil was the economic centerpiece of the Portuguese Empire. The coastline, dotted with cities like Salvador, Recife, and later Rio de Janeiro, saw bustling trade, vivid social stratification, and the emergence of a population of mixed ancestry. Portuguese, African, indigenous, or all three, a testament to the complexities of colonial encounter. Jesuit missionaries played a central role, both evangelizing indigenous groups and engaging in conflicts with colonial authorities over the treatment of native Brazilians. The Society of Jesus established missions known as aldeias, which shielded some indigenous communities from the worst abuses of slavery, while simultaneously transforming traditional lifeways with religious, linguistic, and agricultural instruction. Nonetheless, the hierarchy of colonial Brazil was deeply racialized. Whiteness, European birth, and property defined elite status, while African and indigenous peoples were coerced into the lowest ranks, often as chattel. Manumission legal freedom for some slaves was possible and did occur, but the vast majority of enslaved Africans and their descendants remained property. Over time, Brazil's society developed both spaces of violent oppression and of creative adaptation. Runaway slave communities, the most celebrated being Palmares in the northeast, staged powerful acts of resistance, sometimes surviving for decades before falling to colonial expeditions. The broader Atlantic, competition and connection. This Atlantic system was not insulated. Portuguese power attracted rivals, especially the French, English, and Dutch, who sought their own share of sugar, land, and wealth, sometimes by piracy and smuggling, sometimes by outright invasion. In the early 17th century, Dutch forces seized portions of northeastern Brazil, holding territory for decades and implementing their own, sometimes more religiously tolerant, plantation regime before being forcibly expelled by Portuguese-Brazilian resistance. Alongside Brazil and Africa, the Portuguese maintained a constellation of other Atlantic holdings: Cape Verde, São Tomé and Príncipe, and Guinea-Bissau. Each was both base and commercial node, supplying slaves, foodstuffs, or serving as way stations for the empire's Atlantic circulations. By the late 17th century, Brazil was no longer just a distant colony. Its wealth pulled the gravity of the empire ever westward. Faced with the growing importance of Brazil, Portuguese monarchs devoted ever more attention and investment to the Atlantic world, a trend that would only intensify in the coming centuries. Yet every success bore new strains. The empire's administrative capacities struggled to keep pace with new wealth. Competition from other colonial powers undermined monopolies, and internal contradictions between liberty and enslavement, commerce and ethics, identity and otherness festered beneath the surface. New challenges loomed on every horizon. In both Asia and the Atlantic, the edifice of global empire stood atop shifting sands. The saga of Portugal, From Borderland Kingdom to Maritime Vanguard. Part 4. Cross and Crown. Faith, Education, and Crisis. Within Empire, from its birth in the fires of the Reconquista, Catholicism was far more than a private conviction in Portugal. It was the marrow of the state, the force that linked royal authority to cosmic legitimacy. As Portugal's ships circled the globe, the impulse to conquer and trade carried within it the imperative to convert. The Portuguese Empire, in propaganda and reality, was as much a spiritual project as a material one. The salient of the faithful, Catholicism and the legitimacy of empire. The papal bull that legitimized Portuguese independence had, from the start, cast the kingdom's mission as one of evangelization and struggle against unbelievers. That logic survived into the imperial age, coloring expansion as crusade, commerce as divine work, and colonization as an extension of Christian duty. Early Portuguese explorers sailed under religious banners, and royal charters for expeditions typically demanded that as land was claimed for the crown, it would be held in the name of God and of the Holy Church. Conquistadors and missionaries alike saw themselves as agents of providence, tasked by God and the Pope with extending the bounds of Christendom. In the New Worlds, the cross and the sword traveled together. Chaplains served soldiers, and soon after the conquest of territory, friars and priests arrived to celebrate Mass and build the first fragile churches. Missionaries, Jesuits, and the engines of conversion. But turning empire into Christendom required more than ritual. The conversion of heathen peoples became an organized project with unpredictable results. The early missionary effort was eclectic and local. Franciscans, Dominicans, and other orders followed the Portuguese to Asia, Africa, and the Americas, establishing missions, learning local tongues, and clashing with both indigenous tradition and colonial violence. The 16th century witnessed the arrival of a new force, the Society of Jesus, or Jesuits, founded by Ignatius of Loyola in 1540, and quickly recognized as the intellectual and missionary spearhead of the Catholic Counter-Reformation. Jesuits embedded themselves at the very core of the Portuguese imperial enterprise operating schools for elite sons in Lisbon, colleges and seminaries in Goa, the Rome of the East, Malacca and Macau, and settlements for native peoples in Brazil's interior. In India, Jesuit priests like Francis Xavier traveled relentlessly along the coast and into the hinterland, preaching, baptizing, and often engaging in reasoned debate with Brahmins and Muslim scholars. Xavier's mission in Japan was perhaps the most extraordinary. Adapting Catholic liturgy to Japanese etiquette, he and his successors converted thousands, including some powerful daimyo. The hope of a Christian Japan, though ultimately quashed by the Tokugawa shogunate, captured the imagination of Europe and set off a flurry of literary and diplomatic exchange. In Africa, the Jesuits worked both among enslaved peoples in Portuguese forts and, most notably, within the Kingdom of Congo, where royal baptism brought genuine, if syncretic, Christian conversion at the highest levels. Congolese and other African Christians, using Portuguese clergy and later local priests, maintained Christian communities for centuries, even after the decline of European political control. In Brazil, the Jesuits created aldeias, mission settlements where indigenous peoples were converted, taught to farm, and, in theory, protected from the worst abuses of colonial society. the Jesuits often entered into open conflict with plantation owners and the secular colonial administration over the treatment of natives. Everywhere in the empire, Jesuits founded colleges, taught Greek and Latin, introduced European philosophy and science, and produced maps, grammars, dictionaries, and scholarly studies of local cultures. Their legacy was mixed, at times defenders of the oppressed, at others agents of enforced assimilation and social control. Naayasna, religious tensions, hierarchy, and social order. The religious structure of the empire mirrored its political hierarchy. Bishops and archbishops, appointed under the Padroado Real system of royal patronage, wielded spiritual and temporal power alike. Churches and brotherhoods, hermandades, dotted every town. Convents, monasteries, and religious festivals organized the rhythm of life from metropolitan Lisbon to the wilds of Brazil or India. Yet the faith imported by the Portuguese was steadily adapted, hybridized, and resisted by peoples who lived under empire. African slaves in Brazil blended Catholic saints with Yoruba, Bantu, and other deities, fashioning new syncretic faiths, Candomblé, Umbanda, and others. Indigenous god spirits were often translated into Christian forms. In India and East Asia, local converts navigated the demands of new faith with their own traditions, sometimes creating religious forms the European clergy barely recognized. The empire's religious culture thus became a mosaic of sharp orthodoxy and vibrant hybridity, a world of processions and inquisitions, but also of saints with brown faces and festivals redolent of drums, incense, and food from many continents. Crisis and change, succession, and the roots of decline. Yet, for all its pageantry and institutional strength, the imperial religious order was bound up in the fate of the crown. When political crisis came, it threatened both cross and crown alike. The late 16th century brought such a crisis. King Sebastian, young and pious, had become obsessed with recapturing a crusader glory. In 1578, he led a disastrous military campaign into Morocco, a debacle that saw the Portuguese army destroyed and the king himself vanished, body never found. The fate of the Sebastianist myth would haunt Portuguese imagination for centuries. Hope for a lost king's return turning into a symbol of national longing in times of crisis. With the childless death of Sebastian and his aged uncle, Cardinal Henrique, the Portuguese throne passed to multiple competing claimants. Most powerful among them was Philip II of Spain, a Habsburg and grandson of a Portuguese king. Through military might and persuasion, Philip seized Lisbon in 1580 and was accepted as king. Thus began the Iberian Union. For 60 years, Portugal retained its formal independence, but its monarch was the King of Spain. In theory, Portugal kept its own laws, coinage, and colonial administration. In practice, the entwined empires exposed Portugal's holdings to new dangers and resentments. Empire in the balance, foreign threats and national resistance. The Iberian Union had immediate and fateful consequences for the empire. As Spain's fortunes waned and the Dutch rebellion intensified, the Dutch Republic, England, and France, a triad of rising Protestant maritime powers, attacked Portuguese interests wherever possible. Dutch privateers seized Elmina and Luanda in Africa, overran Malacca and parts of the Spice Islands, and most painfully, captured the lucrative sugar-producing region of northeast Brazil. Back in Portugal itself, dissatisfaction grew. A sense of national distinctiveness burned quietly, fueled by grievances over ruined trade, Spanish appointments to high offices, and the loss of overseas outposts. This mounting tension culminated in 1640, when a group of Portuguese nobles, marshalling popular and military support, overthrew the Spanish viceroy and declared Juan IV of the House of Braganza the king of a restored, independent Portugal. The Restoration War that followed would be a generational contest, not only for sovereignty at home, but for the empire itself, now battered and incomplete, but still vast. Crown and Cross. After the Restoration, the end of union with Spain re-energized the Portuguese sense of national mission, but it did not erase the mounting pressures on the empire. The papacy, conscious of shifting European alliances, recognized the new monarchy. The Jesuits and church authorities continued their wide-ranging evangelization, often attempting to mediate between desperate colonial authorities and the aspirations of subject populations. Religion remained both a source of social stability and an arena of fierce contestation. The duality of faith as a tool of legitimation for the crown and a potential avenue of resistance for colonized peoples would persist long after the golden age of exploration had faded. In these turbulent years, the Portuguese imperial system was forced to reckon with challenges both from within and without. Religious ferment, growing international competition, and the relentless churn of a society built on diversity, violence, and fragile alliances. The stage was set for a new Phase 1 where the Atlantic, and especially Brazil, would come to eclipse the old order, and the empire would adapt, survive, and be tested anew. The saga of Portugal, from borderland kingdom to maritime vanguard. Part 5. Recovery and Resilience, Rebuilding an Empire in Turmoil. The mid-17th century opened on a Portugal that was battered and wary. 60 years under Spanish rule had tested the fabric of both nation and empire. The independence restored in 1640 was hard-won, and the world that Portugal rejoined had changed almost beyond recognition. The once unchallenged maritime empire now faced a crowded, competitive, and often hostile global environment. The shadow of rebellion, the Restoration War and colonial survival. The Restoration War, 1640 and 1668, was not only a fight for the home kingdom. Though the Braganza dynasty's coup in Lisbon was swift, the effort to preserve independence demanded sacrifices on every front. Spain, reluctant to relinquish a kingdom with such vast possessions, launched repeated campaigns to reclaim control. Along Portugal's borders, battle after battle raged. In the empire, loyalist and rebel forces grappled for supremacy. International diplomacy came to Portugal's aid. France and England, both seeking to weaken Spanish hegemony, offered support. Most crucially, the marriage of Catherine of Braganza to England's Charles II in 1662 forged an alliance, one of Europe's most enduring that would shape maritime and colonial competition for centuries. English troops, trade, and naval support buttressed Portugal's position, even as rivalries simmered beneath the alliance. A key arena of the restoration struggle was Brazil itself. Here, colonists faced relentless Dutch attacks, culminating in the decades-long Dutch occupation of the Northeast. Under governors like John Maurice of Nassau, Dutch New Holland became an experiment in multicultural colonial rule and scientific inquiry, where Jews, Protestants, Catholics, Africans, and indigenous peoples all coexisted, sometimes uneasily, sometimes creatively. But the Dutch hold in Brazil proved fragile. A long, grinding struggle marked by guerrilla warfare, alliances with local defenders, and the mobilization of Brazil's diverse populations ultimately drove out the Dutch by 1654. The expulsion was celebrated not merely as a military feat, but as a vindication of Portuguese Brazilian identity. A partnership between metropole and colony forged in shared hardship. competition and loss, Asia and Africa eclipsed. Yet, while Brazil was restored, the situation in Africa and Asia grew dire. The Dutch and English East India Companies, armed with powerful navies and aggressive commercial strategies, dismantled the Portuguese network in Asia, often with the grudging assistance or acquiescence of local rulers, weary of Portuguese monopolies and religious interference. Malacca, once the jewel of the East, fell in 1641. The Spice Islands became Dutch territory, and Portuguese power was rolled back to a handful of isolated posts. Goa and the enclaves of Daman and Diu in India, Macau in China, and the small, embattled Timor. These remnants retained symbolic significance, but could never replicate the vast wealth or dominance of the early decades. In Africa, Portuguese forts hung on in Angola and Mozambique, now less as trade outposts for Asian goods than as centers of slave export for the Americas. The coastlines remained dotted with the whitewashed fortresses of Elmina, Luanda, and others, but the dazzling promise of African gold and pepper was long gone. Increasingly, these posts became entwined in the violent, corrosive circuits of the slave trade. Reform and retrenchment, bureaucratic empire. Confronted by both adversity and opportunity, the Braganza monarchy implemented a variety of reforms to restore a semblance of order. The Portuguese imperial administration, often woefully inadequate, was increasingly centralized from Lisbon. Viceroys, governors general, bishops, and captain majors were appointed with clearer mandates, made answerable to tighter councils and oversight boards. Portugal also restructured the Casa de India, the great state company that had once supervised navigation, trade, and taxation from Goa to Lisbon, to adapt to dwindling Asian revenue, shifting its focus more toward Atlantic interests and colonial governance. In Brazil, local self-government grew in strength as the economic importance of the colony exceeded all previous limits. Sugar output, though challenged by Caribbean competitors, continued to flood European markets. Ports and coastal cities swelled. The wealth generated was now indispensable to the metropole's survival. Yet, even in recovery, new fissures emerged. Colonial administration, plagued by corruption and distance, proved hard to control. Communication between Lisbon and Rio de Janeiro took months. Local interests often clashed with metropolitan directives. The practical reality was a polyglot, local set of autonomies, often operating in the shadow of a distant, rarely present crown. Faith in transition. Jesuits and cultural adaptation religion remained the glue of empire, but also a source of controversy and transformation. The Jesuit missions, particularly in Brazil and Paraguay, expanded both their scope and their political ambition. Jesuits established vast mission territories, reductions, where indigenous peoples could live beyond the reach of colonial predation, learn Christian doctrine, and farm communally. These missions, remarkably successful as both spiritual and economic communities, were often at odds with colonial settlers and the Portuguese state, who resented Jesuit protection of native labor and their perceived challenge to royal authority. Tensions flared. Accusations of conspiracies and rebellion became common between Jesuit enclaves and secular powers. Elsewhere, religious syncretism deepened. In Brazilian towns and coastal Africa, Catholic saints walked alongside indigenous and African spirits. Festivals blended Gregorian chants with drums and dances. The structures of Baroque churches and the hierarchy of bishops brought some stability. But spiritual life in the empire was a hybrid project, full of negotiation and adaptation. The Gold Rush, Minas Gerais, and the shifting center of gravity. As the 17th century drew to a close, a new source of wealth revolutionized the empire and set its final modern course. Explorer settlers known as bandeirantes, originally adventurers hunting runaway slaves and indigenous captives, pushed deep into Brazil's interior. In the remote uplands in the 1690s, they discovered gold-rich deposits scattered across the region that would soon be called Minas Gerais, General Mines. The news spread like wildfire. Within years, miners, merchants, clergy, slaves, and opportunists converged on the interior. Towns like Vila Rica, now Ouro Preto, sprang up almost overnight, their churches and homes glittering with the riches drawn from the earth. This gold boom fueled dramatic change. The colonial economy diversified, infrastructure expanded, the population swelled. The crown, eager to claim its due, imposed the Quinto A 20% tax on gold produced. Enforcement was fierce. Inspectors, troops, and punitive expeditions suppressed smuggling and revolts. The influx of African slaves increased as mine labor intensified. New systems of forced migration and social stratification took shape. Lisbon, now heavily dependent on the gold from Brazil, gained the means to retain diplomatic independence, finance its wars and court, and even rebuild after the devastating earthquake of 1755. Yet the costs were high. The new wealth created dependency, bred corruption, and set up the economic polarization that would haunt both metropole and colony. Society in flux, urban life and the seeds of discontent. Colonial Brazil, once a distant outpost, now eclipsed Lisbon in wealth, population, and cultural vitality. Rio de Janeiro eventually became the capital, displacing Salvador as the seat of power, and the social world of Brazil was transformed. A new eclectic elite emerged: landed proprietors, rich merchants, mine owners, often of mixed ancestry, stood beside Portuguese-born bureaucrats and clergy. Urban spaces flowered with the arts. Poetry, sculpture, sacred architecture, and music drew on African, European, and indigenous influences to create something vibrantly new. Yet beneath the surface, tensions festered. The profits of empire flowed to the crown and to a narrow elite. Most Brazilians enslaved Africans and their descendants, indigenous peoples, dispossessed poor whites, lived with hardship and few rights. The sheer scale of gold extraction deformed both landscape and society. The contradictions would not remain dormant. Enlightenment ideas, simmering colonial resentments, and rivalry between metropolitan and colonial elites were setting seeds that would burst into the open in the 18th and 19th centuries. But for the moment, Portugal's resilience had allowed its empire to survive, diminished in Asia, deeply invested in the South Atlantic, ever more entwined with Brazil, and balanced uneasily between stability and revolt. The saga of Portugal, from borderland kingdom to maritime vanguard. Part 6, Enlightenment and Upheaval, Reforming Empire in an Age of Crisis. As the 18th century dawned, Portugal found itself at a crossroads. The staggering wealth flowing from the gold mines of Brazil had transformed the country's fortunes, but it also made the empire frighteningly dependent on colonial extraction. Discontent simmered in the countryside and cities, where structural poverty and rigid social hierarchies bred frustration among both the enslaved and the free. Enlightenment thought, spreading from France, Britain, and even Brazil itself, began to stir questions that threatened to unravel the old order. What was the true source of authority? Could a nation afford to cling to tradition if it risked falling behind its rivals? The emergence of a new kind of statesman would give Portugal both a chance at self-renewal and a foretaste of the tensions that would, in time, help to undo its global empire. Earthquake and Enlightenment, the rise of the Marquis of Pombal. On November the 1st, 1755, the city of Lisbon was struck by one of the most devastating disasters in European history. As thousands of worshippers gathered in churches for All Saints' Day Mass, the earth convulsed with unimaginable force. Buildings collapsed, fires raged, and a tsunami swept through the harbor. In a matter of hours, the capital lay in ruins. Tens of thousands lay dead. King Jose was traumatized by the disaster, withdrawing from public view. Into this void stepped his chief minister, Sebastião José de Carvalho, a mellow soon to be made the Marquis of Pombal. His response was immediate, and by the standards of the time, revolutionary. "Bury the dead and feed the living," he declared, organizing rescue efforts, imposing martial order, and beginning a rebuilding program that would turn disaster into profound, if sometimes ruthless, transformation. The new Lisbon rose as a model of Enlightenment rationality, earthquake-resistant buildings, wide boulevards, and systematic urban planning that embodied the modern spirit. Pombal saw an opportunity not only to reconstruct the city, but the very foundations of the Portuguese state. Reform and modernization. Pombal's new order. Pombal's program of reform was as ambitious as it was authoritarian, determined to break the power of traditional elites, especially the old landed aristocracy and the Jesuits. He expanded royal authority and centralized administration. The bureaucratic apparatus was modernized, tax collection made more efficient, smuggling cracked down upon, and trade companies chartered to expand and systematize imperial commerce. Perhaps nowhere was his ruthlessness more evident than in the expulsion of the Jesuits in 1759. Once the intellectual and spiritual center of the overseas missions, the Jesuits had become, in Pombal's view, a dangerously independent force, more loyal to Rome than Lisbon, more interested in local autonomy than royal control. Their missions in Brazil and Paraguay were dissolved, their property confiscated, their schools shuttered or remade. The protections they had offered indigenous communities vanished almost overnight. Settlers and colonial authorities quickly occupied the vacuum. Pombal also took direct interest in the administration of Brazil, tightening control over the captaincies, cracking down on corruption and contraband, and sending inspectors to enforce the quinto on gold production. Education was transformed. Jesuit control ended, new secular schools were established, and the curriculum shifted toward practical sciences, modern languages, and administrative skills. A class of technocratic administrators loyal to the crown began to take shape. State, society, and economy. The cost of reform. Pombal's reforms modernized the state, but did so through force and fear. Censorship was widespread. Critics were exiled, imprisoned, or in the infamous Tavora affair, publicly executed. The nobility was cowed, the church subdued, and even the crown itself became dependent on a bureaucracy that now reached to the far corners of the empire. In Brazil, the reforms had the effect of both strengthening central authority and sparking local tensions. The interior was opened for new settlements, and efforts were made to promote frontier agriculture, cattle raising, and even cotton and tobacco production. The Amazon region, long a backwater, received a renewed influx of settlers as the government tried to assert its sovereignty against both Spain and independent local chieftains. Yet gold, for all the hope it once inspired, was a finite resource. By the late 18th century, easily accessible deposits were exhausted, smuggling had become rampant, and the crown's revenue was under threat. regional tensions festered as the south and north of Brazil jockeyed for influence, and the centralization of tax collection provoked resistance from mine owners and traders. Cultural and social changes were equally profound. Amid the riches of the gold boom, a unique artistic tradition flowered in Minas Gerais Baroque churches and sculptures, sacred music and poetry that fused Portuguese, African, and indigenous forms. Yet the wealth was distributed with gross inequality. A handful of mine owners and traders grew fantastically rich, while the enslavement of Africans intensified. Manumission was possible and sometimes achieved, but the society remained rigidly hierarchical and racially stratified. The intellectual climate, meanwhile, was shifting. The Enlightenment spirit that animated Pombal's reforms also seeped into the consciousness of colonial elites. Forbidden books and ideas circulated through secret societies and scholarly correspondence, raising questions about the justice of royal absolutism, the legitimacy of slavery, and the rights of subjects and colonies alike. Aftermath: the passing of Pombal and the seeds of revolution. Pombal's era came to a close in 1777 with the death of King José I. His successor, Queen Maria I, harbored a deep suspicion of her father's minister and quickly dismissed him. Some of his harshest policies were repealed. The church regained limited powers, and the old nobility reasserted itself in court and administration. But the momentum of modernization could not easily be reversed. Portuguese society was fundamentally changed, its imperial system now harder, more centralized, and less tolerant of local variation. Yet beneath the order imposed by Pombal, the seeds of revolution had been sown. In Minas Gerais, the so-called Inconfidencia Mineira, a conspiracy by local elites, inspired by the American and French revolutions, advocating for a Brazilian republic, exploded into the open in the 1780s. Though brutally crushed, it signaled that colonial subjecthood, once an accepted norm, was being questioned as never before. Outside Portugal, the wider world was changing even more rapidly. The independence of the United States, the French Revolution, and the subsequent rise of Napoleon sent shockwaves through every monarchy in Europe. The old certainties, divine kingship, natural hierarchy, immutable borders were shattered. Portugal, now a minor power, but still a global empire, was about to be swept into the currents of modern history. Toward a new era, crisis and opportunity in the Atlantic. It was not reform alone that would shape the coming decades. As the 18th century closed and the 19th began, Europe was convulsed by the wars of the French Revolution, and finally, the political and military genius of Napoleon Bonaparte. As always, Portugal's fate was bound to its alliances. The ancient friendship with Britain remained, and Lisbon refused to comply with Napoleon's blockade. In 1807, as French troops approached, the entire Portuguese royal family and much of its court fled across the ocean to Rio de Janeiro, choosing, in a stunning act without parallel in colonial history, to make their South American colony the seat of empire. This forced migration was both a last-ditch effort to preserve the monarchy and a radical reordering of the imperial system. Brazil, once the periphery, suddenly became the center of a transatlantic world. Across 2 continents and 4 centuries, Portugal's ability to learn, adapt, and reform had preserved its empire against the odds. But now, wrenched by revolution, war, and enlightenment, the empire would face its greatest test: survival in an age of nationhood and liberty. The Saga of Portugal, from borderland kingdom to maritime vanguard. Part 7, Revolutions and Relocations. Brazil becomes the heart of empire. By the dawn of the 19th century, the world Portugal had navigated for so long was turning upside down. The age of Revolution, American, French, Haitian, had stoked fires of liberty and national identity that no monarchy could ignore. Portugal, small but imperial, precariously watched as its economy and sovereign security became increasingly bound to larger powers. The British, partners since the 14th century through the ancient Treaty of Windsor, and the continental ambitions of Napoleonic France. The Lisbon Exodus, flight to Brazil. In 1807, the threat Napoleon posed stopped being theoretical. Having forced Spain into abetting his ambitions, Napoleon put increasing pressure on Portugal to join the continental system, a blockade designed to isolate Britain. Portugal's centuries-old alliance with Britain, however, was central to its survival and prosperity. When Prince Regent João, the future King João VI, refused to close Portuguese ports to British trade, Napoleon's patience snapped. French troops under General Junot marched toward Lisbon. Few episodes in world history are as dramatic or consequential as the escape that followed. On November 29, 1807, as French forces neared the city, the entirety of the Portuguese royal family, the court, top administrators, and a host of nobles, artists, soldiers, merchants, and servants, more than 10,000 people embarked under British naval protection for Brazil. Lisbon, once the imperial capital, was left leaderless as the world's only instance of a European monarch governing from a colony began. After a turbulent Atlantic crossing, the exiles landed first in Salvador and eventually in Rio de Janeiro. The consequences were profound. Brazil, for centuries the periphery of empire, suddenly became its heart. Government ministries and archives were recreated in Rio. The city transformed overnight, its streets and squares filled with court rituals, commerce, and the arrival of a diverse cosmopolitan population. Printing presses, previously forbidden to the colony, proliferated. The arts, sciences, and administration flourished. Brazil's ports were thrown open to world trade in 1808, undermining old colonial monopolies and accelerating the development of a distinctly Brazilian economy and society. Yet the English presence was unavoidable. British merchants flooded Rio's shops, British officers manned fortresses, and British bankers acquired influence in both commerce and diplomacy. For many in Brazil, the influx meant opportunity. For some in Portugal, it was a humiliation. Liberal ideas and unrest in Europe and America. While the Portuguese royal court settled in Rio, Europe continued to convulse. The Napoleonic Wars devastated Spain, unleashed guerrilla warfare across the Iberian Peninsula, and after years of struggle and British intervention, ultimately drove French armies out. Portuguese territory was liberated from direct French rule by 1811, but only at enormous economic and social cost. The exposure of both Portugal and Brazil to the wider world had also led to the spread of liberal ideas. Monarchic absolutism, long the ideological foundation of empire, was increasingly questioned. Newspapers reported the drama of the French Revolution, the abolition of monarchy in Haiti and elsewhere, and crucially, the emergence of constitutional regimes. The British model above all, but also the new constitutional order taking root in Spain after the Cortes of Cádiz in 1812. Meanwhile, Latin America was in the throes of anti-colonial revolt. Spanish America erupted into wars of independence that would soon sweep away centuries of imperial control from Mexico to Argentina. The Portuguese monarchy, now ensconced in Brazil, could not ignore the trend. the United Kingdom of Portugal, Brazil, and the Algarves, faced with growing political sophistication among the Brazilian elite, continued unrest in Portugal, and the challenge of governing an empire across two continents. Prince Regent João raised Brazil's status in 1815. The territory was henceforth no longer a colony, but elevated as a co-equal part of the United Kingdom of Portugal, Brazil, and the Algarves. For the first time, Brazilian-born nobles and officials enjoyed status nearly equal to their Portuguese counterparts. Rio became a metropolis befitting the seat of empire, a capital with libraries, schools, and a flourishing cultural life. Still, the changes were double-edged. While Brazilian elites benefited from freer commerce and royal attention, the specter of European-style reforms, such as abolition of slavery or greater popular participation in government, alarmed established interests. Social tensions remained, especially as the wealth gap widened. The return to Lisbon, the liberal revolution, and a looming crisis by 1820, the chain of historical dominoes reached its tipping point. A new liberal revolution erupted in Porto, Portugal, demanding the king's return, a constitution, and representative governance. The revolutionaries set up the Cortes, a constitutional assembly that inspired copied revolts across the country. At their insistence, King João VI returned to Lisbon in 1821 reluctantly, and only after securing his son Pedro's appointment as regent in Brazil. The Cortes in Lisbon, imbued with the ideals of constitutionalism, sought to reassert metropolitan authority over Brazil, reverse its near-equal status, and restore strict colonial ties. Brazilian elites, enriched and empowered by more than a decade of royal proximity and liberal economic policies, saw this as an existential threat to their social status and economic freedom. The seeds of division had been sown in the very moment Brazil had achieved parity. The road to Brazilian independence. The stage was now set for rupture. Lisbon's attempts to revert Brazil to its colonial status led to outcry committees, public rallies, and street demonstrations grew commonplace in Rio and other regional centers. Pressure mounted on Pedro, now Prince Regent, to choose sides. On January 9, 1822, in what would become famous as the Dia do Fico, I am staying day, Pedro defied the Cortes, declaring his intention to remain in Brazil despite Lisbon's orders. Tensions swiftly escalated. Over the following months, Prince Pedro dissolved Portuguese-backed governing bodies, recruited local elites and military leaders to his side, and organized a constituent assembly to consider Brazil's future. As Lisbon tried to clamp down with new directives, Pedro calling on both the rising tide of Brazilian nationalism and his own legitimacy as the son of the king, declared Brazil's independence from Portugal on September 7, 1822, with the legendary cry, Independencia ou Morte, independence or death. By December, Pedro was crowned Emperor Pedro V of Brazil. The new empire, while preserving a constitutional monarchy, derived its sovereignty from Brazil's soil and its own people. The war to secure independence continued for more than a year in some provinces, but the outcome was not in doubt. Portugal could not supply the men or money to reconquer Brazil, especially with Britain urging a diplomatic settlement. In 1825, Lisbon formally recognized Brazil's independence. The greatest outpost of empire had become a nation, and the center of gravity for much of the former Portuguese world now shifted decisively to the South Atlantic. The aftermath, loss, continuity, and a changing order. The end of Portuguese rule in Brazil was not an ending, but a transformation. most of the commercial, familial, and social connections between the two countries endured. Many Portuguese immigrants remained in or moved to Brazil, while Brazilian businessmen and intellectuals often looked to Lisbon and beyond for ideas and partners. For Portugal, however, the loss was a shattering blow. The empire's wealthiest and most populous possession was gone. The economy, now deprived of Brazilian gold, sugar, and coffee, entered a prolonged period of crisis. Dynastic disputes, civil war, and political turbulence would hound the country throughout the rest of the 19th century. Yet, the end of empire in Brazil was also a beginning. Portugal turned its gaze to Africa and Asia anew, dreaming of a revived imperial mission even as the world was clearly moving into an age of national independence and technological revolution. The saga of Portugal, from borderland kingdom to maritime vanguard da Fiera. Part 8, Scramble and Stalemate. Building the Second Empire in Africa. Brazil's independence was an irreparable wound for the Portuguese monarchy and the nation's elites. The enormous flow of sugar, coffee, gold, and customs revenue that had made Lisbon a cosmopolitan imperial capital began to dry up. Portugal, once at the forefront of global exploration, seemed left behind by the swift pace of industrialization, liberal reform, and national self-assertion sweeping through Europe and its former American colonies. And yet, wounded pride and the legacy of centuries of imperial ambition proved enduring. Even as the age of maritime discovery faded, Portugal sought to revive its fortunes and global circumstances by turning toward Africa with renewed determination. The Second Empire. New ambitions on old shores. For centuries, Portugal's African presence had amounted to little more than a thin string of coastal outposts. Luanda and Benguela in Angola, Mozambique Island and small settlements along the Mozambican coast, and minor island colonies like Cape Verde, Guinea-Bissau, and São Tomé and Príncipe. Inland, the empire was at best symbolic. Actual sovereignty in the vast hinterlands was tenuous at best, and in many areas, non-existent. In the later 1800s, all this began to change. The so-called Scramble for Africa, a frantic race for territory among Europe's now industrialized empires, put Portugal in direct competition with mightier, wealthier, and more technologically advanced rivals: Britain, France, Germany, and Belgium. Each dreamed of vast, contiguous territories. Each wielded modern weaponry and statecraft. Portugal, humiliated by its stagnant economy and backward institutions at home, saw in Africa not only prestige, but potential salvation. Lisbon's vision, sometimes called the rose-colored map for its depiction in school textbooks, imagined a horizontal swath of Portuguese Africa stretching from Atlantic Angola eastwards through the heart of the continent to Indian Mozambique, a third continental arch that could restore imperial glory. Diplomacy and disappointment, British ultimatums and national outrage. But the realities of geopolitics would soon crush these ambitions. In 1890, Portugal's dream collided with British designs for a north-south Cape to Cairo corridor, intended to unite its African colonies from Egypt to South Africa. British diplomats delivered an ultimatum demanding Portuguese withdrawal from the heart of Central Africa. With little choice lacking both the military muscle and diplomatic clout to resist, Lisbon reluctantly acquiesced. The defeat was humiliating. Across Portugal, mass protests broke out, and the monarchy's hold on legitimacy faltered as republican and nationalist agitation swelled. The British ultimatum of 1890 became a symbol of decline. It its sting not forgotten by future generations. The episode would fuel revolution in 1910, bringing the monarchy to an end and ushering in the First Portuguese Republic. Still, Portugal maintained a tenuous, if largely nominal, claim to sizable territories in both Angola and Mozambique by hastily rushing expeditions and treaties to demarcate boundaries, sometimes merely on paper, sometimes through skirmishes, pacification campaigns, and the cooperation, or subjugation, of local African polities. Empire by concession, companies, chibalo, and the costs of control. With limited resources and administrative manpower, Portugal turned to privatization, granting powerful chartered companies wide autonomy to exploit vast expanses of Angola and Mozambique. These companies, like the Mozambique Company and the Niassa Company, were granted monopolies over taxation, labor, crop production, and trade for decades at a stretch. In exchange, they were expected to develop the land, build railways and towns, and extract resources for the benefit of both company and metropole. In practice, this system fostered harsh exploitation. Forced labor systems known as chibalo were introduced to compel Africans to work on plantations, in mines, and on railway lines, conditions often amounting to serfdom or even modern slavery. Racial hierarchies became brutally entrenched. Portuguese settlers, never very numerous, and a small Creole elite held power while the African majority lived under coercive law, excluded from not only citizenship but basic civil rights. The rhetoric of civilization and mission masked an economy bent on coercion, expropriation, and resistance. Local African communities responded with a mix of adaptation and resistance. Some collaborated, gaining positions of local authority or economic advantage. Others rebelled, leading uprisings rarely successful but persistent, often put down with ruthless violence. In cities like Lourenço Marques, now Maputo, and Luanda, an African working class began to take shape, while Christian missions, both Catholic and Protestant, promoted limited education and sometimes social critique. Portuguese society at home: tumult, reform, and the myth of empire. Back in Portugal, the Second Empire provided a fragile thread for national identity. School books taught the exploits of old and new explorers, promoting a narrative of racial unity and benevolent paternalism. The state sponsored colonial exhibitions, statues, and a flood of propaganda that painted the African colonies as the birthright of the Portuguese people. A crucial counterpoint to the turbulence and humiliation that defined domestic politics. The First Republic, 1910-1926, was ideologically committed to progress and reform, but seldom delivered it. Chronic instability, dozens of governments in little more than a decade, left the African colonies even more in the hands of local governors, companies, and the Catholic Church. Attempts at integration and development floundered due to both financial constraints and the unwillingness to extend rights and citizenship to the subject majority. Yet, African life went on. Cities grew, workers organized, syncretic religions flourished, and new generations of educated Africans, sometimes the children of missions, sometimes self-taught, began to imagine another future, one outside of colonial rule. Between the world wars, empire under pressure. The outbreak of World War I drew Portugal into battlefield engagements both in Europe and Africa, particularly against German forces seeking to expand or protect their own colonial territories. African soldiers and laborers conscripted into the Portuguese army, or as porters paid a steep price, only to return to rigid colonial hierarchies that denied their sacrifice or aspirations. After Versailles, Portugal's colonial claims were recognized internationally, but at the price of even closer international scrutiny. In the interwar years, the wind of change was beginning, even if faint at first. African journalists, teachers, and labor organizers began to form mutual aid societies and cultural clubs in Luanda, Maputo, and the island towns, sowing the seeds of the future nationalist movements. Yet, the myth of the eternal, unchanging Portuguese world persisted for a time, propped up by government and bolstered by the authoritarian regime that would soon seize power at home. Estado Novo, Salazar, dictatorship, and the imperial stalemate. The rise of Antonio de Oliveira Salazar, founding the Estado Novo, new state dictatorship in 1933, brought new vigor and rigidity to the imperial project. Salazar asserted that the overseas provinces were not colonies, but extensions of Portugal itself, indivisible and eternal. In practice, this fiction masked an ever more exploitative regime, buttressed by censorship, secret police, and military force. Economic modernization remained slow, investment minimal, and forced labor routine. African voices demanding rights and opportunities found little purchase in Salazar's world. Nevertheless, a new generation of nationalist leaders, some educated in Lisbon, some in missionary schools, and some radicalized by exile, were about to transform the colonial equation, drawing inspiration not only from global anti-colonial movements, but also from Portugal's own revolutionary traditions. As the Second World War approached, Portugal's Second Empire spanned thousands of miles, housed millions, and seemed to its rulers as permanent as the ocean. But the roots of resistance had begun to grow in the dark, unseen but irrepressible. The Saga of Portugal, from borderland kingdom to maritime vanguard. Part 9. War, Revolution, and the Unraveling of Empire. As the mid-20th century dawned, the world was being rapidly remade. The Second World War shattered the old imperial order and unleashed powerful new currents of nationalism, self-determination, and anti-colonialism across Asia and Africa. The United Nations, decolonization, and Cold War rivalries all converged on the question of empire now marked as outmoded, unjust, and unsustainable by much of global opinion. Portugal, under the long shadow of Salazar's Estado Novo, would resist these changes longer and more violently than any other colonial power in Western Europe, convinced of its civilizing mission and the inseparability of metropolis and province. Durines, the regime entrenched, Estado Novo, and the colonial system. Antonio de Oliveira Salazar had, from the 1930s on, reshaped Portugal into a tightly controlled authoritarian corporatist state, suspicious of both liberalism and communism, censorship, secret police, the PIDE, and a web of informers silenced dissident voices. Any reforms to the colonial system were cosmetic. The regime insisted that Angola, Mozambique, Guinea-Bissau, Cape Verde, and São Tomé and Príncipe were not colonies, but overseas provinces, integral to the nation. Racial discrimination, the Chibalo system of forced labor, and rigid educational and property qualifications kept Africans disenfranchised and impoverished. Portuguese settlers, with official encouragement, increased somewhat, particularly in Angola and Mozambique, where they occupied better lands and dominated the minor professions, commerce, and bureaucracy. Education, so often the harbinger of change, was rationed. A tiny African elite, assimilados, were admitted to dubious equality in exchange for cultural and linguistic Portugueseness. But such status was hard to achieve and often precarious. Most Africans were subject to the indigenato, a parallel legal system locking them out of civil and economic rights. Yet the outside world was moving. Across sub-Saharan Africa, new nations emerged in rapid succession during the 1950s and 1960s, often through negotiation, sometimes through bloody revolution. India, newly independent, dealt Portugal sharp defeats in Goa, Daman, and Diu, seizing the last Asian possessions in 1961. The writing seemed on the wall. African nationalism awakens. It was Africans themselves who forced the issue. From the 1940s onward, small circles of intellectuals and activists, many of them teachers, clerks, artisans, and erudite young men and women in Luanda, Bissau, Maputo, and Lisbon, emerged as the first generation of anti-colonial leaders. Some were influenced by Marxism or Pan-Africanism, others by Catholic social justice principles, or even by borrowed lessons from Portugal's own republican and resistance traditions. Writers and poets, such as Agostinho Neto of Angola and Amilcar Cabral of Guinea-Bissau and Cape Verde, used literature and clandestine organization to knit together fractured communities, debated strategies for liberation, and built bridges between disparate regions and ethnic groups. The decisive step was the turn to armed struggle. In the early 1960s, three main revolutionary movements arose. In Angola, the MPLA, Movimento Popular de Libertação de Angola, the FNLA, Frente Nacional de Libertação de Angola, and later UNITA, União Nacional para a Independência Total de Angola, bitterly divided by ethnicity, ideology, and foreign alliances. In Mozambique, Frelimo, Frente de Libertação de Moçambique, led first by Eduardo Mondlane, later by Samora Machel. In Guiné-Bissau and Cape Verde, PAIGC, Partido Africano para a Independência da Guiné e Cabo Verde, led with astonishing effectiveness and charisma by Amilcar Cabral, funded and assisted by shifting alliances of the Soviet bloc, Cuba, China, Pan-Africanist states such as Ghana, and sometimes Western agencies seeking Cold War advantage. These groups launched ambushes, sabotage campaigns, and eventually sustained organized warfare against Portuguese military and administrative forces. The Long Wars. Colonialism by forced Portugal answered with repression and escalation. Between 1961 and 1974, some 800,000 Portuguese troops would be cycled through the African wars. Conscription was universal. Young men fled the country or emigrated to Brazil, France, or Germany to avoid it. Entire villages in Angola and Mozambique were forcibly relocated into protected villages, aldeamentos, in a bid to starve the guerrillas of support a policy that led to massive displacement and hardship. In Guinea-Bissau, Cabral's pikes established liberated zones with their own schools, clinics, and administration. A rare example of a successful guerrilla government before actual independence. The war there was so effective that Guinea-Bissau declared independence in 1973, and Portugal's allies in Africa and the UN soon recognized the new reality. Throughout Angola and Mozambique, as in Guinea-Bissau, the struggle was merciless. Extrajudicial killings, destruction of crops, civilian massacres, and the presence of mercenaries and foreign powers, especially South Africa and Rhodesia, turned the regions into cauldrons of suffering and radicalization. The cost to the Portuguese treasury was staggering. By the early 1970s, upwards of 40% of the national budget was spent in a futile effort to hold the overseas provinces. Portugal, internationally isolated, condemned at the UN, and cut off from most foreign aid, remained stubbornly committed to victory and to the maintenance of pluricontinental, multiracial nationhood. Resistance within, the end of dictatorship. At home, the colonial wars generated mounting frustration. The economy stagnated. Living standards for ordinary Portuguese lagged far behind Western Europe, and a growing percentage of the population began to question both the endless sacrifices and the regime's legitimacy. Student protests, clandestine labor organizations, and Catholic dissenters increasingly challenged censorship and repression. Even within the military, young officers, often radicalized by their African experiences, secretly debated the war's futility and injustice. The final blow came from within. On April 25, 1974, these junior officers, acting through the Movimento das Forças Armadas, MFA, seized control in Lisbon in the Carnation Revolution, so named because soldiers put flowers in their rifle barrels. The people poured into the streets, and Salazar's successor, Marcelo Caetano, capitulated after a single tense day. The revolution was both surprisingly peaceful and shockingly rapid. Crowds chanted for democracy, the end of censorship and secret police, social rights, but above all, for peace in Africa and the end of the colonial wars. Within months, the MFA government began negotiations with all major African liberation movements. Decolonization, the empire ends. Between 1974 and 1975, centuries of Portugal's imperial presence in Africa unraveled almost overnight. Guinea-Bissau's independence was recognized first. Mozambique and Angola followed, along with Cape Verde and São Tomé and Príncipe. Hundreds of thousands of Portuguese settlers, mixed-race retornados, soldiers, and administrators fled in chaotic and sorrowful conditions, overwhelming Portugal's already struggling social services and reshaping its urban life for decades. Most of the new African states immediately fell into civil conflict. In Angola and Mozambique, the former liberation movements soon found themselves locked in Cold War-fueled civil wars that would last another generation. Guinea-Bissau faced coups and economic disaster. Cape Verde and São Tomé, small and deeply impoverished, struggled for coherence and prosperity. For Portugal, the end of empire was traumatic, but ultimately liberating. The distraction and expense of war gave way to energetic new efforts to modernize and democratize. A new constitution in 1976 enshrined full civil liberties. Portugal joined the European Economic Community, now the EU, in 1986, realigning its identity with Europe rather than the vanished dreams of empire. Macau, Timor, and the lingering shadows. Two small distant remnants remained. Macau in China and East Timor, ruled as Portuguese Timor for centuries. Macau, a unique fusion of East and West, would be peacefully handed over to China in 1999 after decades of negotiation and transition. Timor, however, would suffer a different fate. Invaded and occupied by Indonesia after Portuguese withdrawal in 1975, the territory endured a quarter-century of brutal repression before finally gaining independence in 2002, with Portugal serving as its chief advocate in international forums. Legacy Portugal, once the pilot of the Age of Discovery and the longest-lived of the European overseas empires, had at last come home. Its legacy, profound, contradictory, laced with tragedy and achievement, was both a burden and, in unexpected ways, a resource. Lusophone Africa, Brazil, and even East Timor would remain connected in language and shared history. Today, modern Portugal is unrecognizable from the autarkic, embattled country of Salazar's last days. Yet the threads of empire language, food, music, faith, and the memory of encounter and struggle continue to shape the lives of millions across continents, long after the empire itself vanished from the maps. Thank you for your engagement throughout this saga. Here is Part 10. The concluding installment, which reflects on the end of empire, the challenges of post-colonial identity for Portugal and its former colonies, and the enduring cultural legacy that still binds these disparate lands. Chapter: The Saga of Portugal, from borderland kingdom to maritime vanguard. Part 10. After Empire: Memory, Identity, and the Legacy of a Global World. With the swift and total collapse of its overseas empire after 1974, Portugal was thrust into a profound period of uncertainty. A nation forced to reckon with loss, displacement, and rapid transformation. The end of imperial rule was not simply a geopolitical event. It marked a revolution in what it meant to be Portuguese, for those at home and for the millions who had been subjects, partners, or adversaries in the scattered territories that once colored maps from Brazil to Timor. Thus, a time of return, the retornados, and the social reshaping of Portugal. The return of nearly 500,000 retornados, settlers, and mixed heritage families fleeing Angola, Mozambique, and other colonies triggered a social shock unlike any before. These arrivals swelled Lisbon, Porto, and other cities, straining housing, public services, and national identity. They brought with them not only material hardships, but also a cosmopolitanism, pragmatism, and nostalgia for lost lands that would shape Portugal's culture and politics for years to come. Initially regarded with suspicion or even resentment by their co-nationals, the retornados over time contributed to Portugal's modernization. Many became entrepreneurs, educators, or bridges to the new Lusophone world beyond Europe. Their cuisine, music, and stories enriched national life. Their memories, often painful, sometimes romanticized, added nuance to Portugal's collective understanding of empire. Reconciling the past, democracy, and Europeanization. The revolution that ended colonial rule also brought freedom to Portugal's mainland. After decades of censorship and repression, the nation underwent a burst of creativity and debate. The new constitution guaranteed universal suffrage, civil rights, and freedom for labor unions and women's organizations. Artists and writers explored both the traumas and the wonders of Portugal's imperial inheritance, confronting hard truths and celebrating connections. Economic aid and technical expertise from the European community accelerated growth and encouraged the adoption of European standards. The scars of dictatorship faded, though never disappeared. For much of a generation, Portugal's energies were turned inward, building new institutions, creating a welfare state, and looking northward for identity and assurance, rather than to the vanished empire. Former colonies, the difficult birth of new nations. Meanwhile, in Africa and Asia, the legacies of Portuguese rule were complex and often painful. Angola and Mozambique descended almost immediately into civil war, now fueled by Cold War rivalries, as well as deep social and ethnic fractures. Decades of violence destroyed infrastructure, destabilized regions, and caused devastating humanitarian crises. Guinea-Bissau, after an initial period of optimism, similarly suffered coups, poverty, and political instability. Cape Verde and São Tomé and Príncipe, lacking the mineral wealth of their larger neighbors, faced different but no less daunting challenges: climate, economic marginality, and at times, underdevelopment and outmigration. East Timor, after 24 years of brutal Indonesian occupation, won its independence in 2002, with Portuguese support playing a vital international role. Despite hardship, these new states fostered rich cultural renaissances. Music, literature, and art flourished, drawing from the syncretic traditions forged over centuries: African rhythms, Portuguese language, Caribbean melody, indigenous stories. In time, mutual recognition and collaboration grew as these countries reached for their own place in a global post-imperial world. Lusophonia, the community of Portuguese language countries. In 1996, Recognizing that language, culture, and history could link peoples once divided by power, Portugal joined with Brazil, Angola, Mozambique, Cape Verde, Guinea-Bissau, São Tomé and Príncipe, and later, East Timor, to found the Community of Portuguese Language Countries, CPLP. This organization, an echo of the British Commonwealth or Francophonie, fosters educational, diplomatic, and economic cooperation across continents. Through it, teachers and artists circulate. Trade and investment flow more easily. Common legal and linguistic standards are debated. The CPLP does not erase past wounds, but it provides a framework for dialogue and shared aspiration, transforming the legacy of Portugal's empire into a bridge for the 21st century, rather than a shackle to the past. Macau and the Final Return. The very last chapter in Portugal's imperial story played out in Macau, the oldest and most enduring European enclave in Asia. By the late 20th century, Macau was a bustling, multicultural city, Chinese in majority, but adorned with Portuguese architecture, language, and law. After decades of negotiation and careful transition, sovereignty was returned to China in December 1999 under a one country, two systems arrangement. The transfer was peaceful, marking the understated, dignified end of 6 centuries of overseas rule. Empire's echo, memory, controversy, and identity. Today, in Portugal, the legacy of empire is everywhere and nowhere. Walk the streets of Lisbon or Porto, and you find monuments to explorers, museums of imperial treasures, and churches built with the riches of Brazil and the East. At the same time, post-colonial critique and anti-racist movements have demanded the re-examination of colonial statues, school curricula, and the reckoning with the slave trade and structural racism. For younger generations, the imperial past is more often a topic of debate than of glory, an uncomfortable, complicated inheritance. In Brazil, Angola, Mozambique, and elsewhere, Portuguese persists as both an instrument of opportunity, a language of education, government, and global communication, and a reminder of a fraught history. Music, football, literature, and diaspora keep the connections alive, even as each nation charts its own future. The modern Portuguese identity, from imperial to global citizen Portugal, today is a democratic European country, small in territory but vast in cultural connections. Its population includes Africans, Brazilians, Cape Verdeans, Indians, Chinese, and a new generation of European neighbors. Portuguese cuisine, music, from fado to morna to samba, and literature reflect the tides of global contact. Its economic fortunes now depend as much on tourism, technology, and integration with Europe as on the old circuits of sugar, gold, and slaves. Most fundamentally, the long story of Portugal's empire teaches that history is never static. It is a process of encounter, exchange, adaptation, and remembrance. The Portuguese encountered the world, and the world, in turn, encountered Portugal. From the founding of an independent kingdom on the edge of Europe to the wide arcs of trade, faith, and violence that defined its empires, to the reckoning and reconciliation of the post-colonial present, Portugal's legacy is proof that humanity's journey is always global, always changing, always unfinished.